It's very common to need to switch between one user account and another. It's even common to need to elevate those privileges to the superuser account. The first way we have to do that is with the SU account, or switch user. We can use this command to switch between any user accounts that we have access to. If we try to switch to another user, it'll require us to enter the password for that other user using the SU command. If you want to switch from the regular user to the root user, it'll require you to have the root user's permission in the form of a password. If you're required to enter a password for the switch you're making, the password prompt will appear. Recall that when you enter passwords in Linux, the cursor neither moves nor displays the characters you're typing. Here, I see that I'm the student user. On my account, I have also created a demo user. We'll learn how to do that soon. If I wish to switch between users, I can type SU, switch user command, and then the other user account I wish to switch to, at which point the demo password must be supplied in order to switch users. I'll type that password now, and we can see some error messages that occur for the demo user, but we've correctly switched to that user. I can type exit to return to my original user. Note that when we use the SU command and do not declare a specific user, by default it will switch to the root user. If you have access to that account and have the password, you can supply the root password at that point in time in order to switch to the root superuser account. We see in the output here that they're using the SU followed by a minus sign or dash. The difference here is that when you use SU dash, it'll start as the new user with a login shell. The login shell declared in their entry of etc password. Including the minus sign will set up the shell according to that user's environment. If you omit the minus sign or dash, SU just starts the simple shell that the user was already using, but with the new user account logged in. Feel free to experiment between switching between users using the minus sign or omitting it. In this section, we'll look at running commands with the sudo argument. Many times, we have access to the root account as system administrators. However, it can be more secure to allow access to root privileges without handing out the password to the root user. We can do this by configuring our users with sudo access. Sudo is short for superuser do. I can prepend it to any command that requires superuser privileges and execute it as my own user. If my own user has been configured with this access, I'll then supply my own password and execute the command with the elevated privileges. This allows me system administrative access for commands and areas of the operating system that are outside of my regular user's access, but if I've been granted that superuser privilege, I can then do so by supplying my own password. This keeps an environment secure because then no one with this access who requires those elevated permissions actually knows the root user's password. If you were to have the root user compromised or the individual user's account compromised, you can mitigate this far easier. Editing the etc password file as a regular user is not something that's allowed. We can try as our student user to edit etc password. The file is able to open up. I'll enter the insert mode by pressing I. Notice that I do get a warning message that says I am changing a read-only file. This is because the user I'm currently interacting with, the student user, does not have permissions to edit this file and save changes. Any changes I were to make would be lost when I exit the file. I'll exit the file and quit without saving any changes. Next, let's try prepending this with the sudo argument. Here I'm asking it to interact with the file with elevated root level permissions. As my user is configured to be able to do so without entering a password, I immediately enter into this file. If I hit the insert key and start typing, anything I type in is allowed, as I'm now doing so as the root user. This can be very dangerous, especially in the etc password file, as this file governs all user access. Be careful with the files you interact with using these permissions, as you can do irreparable harm to your environment. I'll exit, and I will not save my changes in this case. Just know that using the sudo command to do so would have allowed me full access to edit the file. You can see some further examples in the book that show using the sudo command to access areas of the file system that are not normally allowed for regular users. Within later versions of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, members of the wheel group can use this sudo privilege. That's actually the configuration that's in place in my environment to allow my student user access to the account root. We can see in etc group the configuration of this group. If we open the file etc group for editing, we can arrow down and see the group wheel. Here, both my student and demo account have been added to the wheel group, meaning that they've been extended privileges to use the sudo command and gain the superuser elevated privileges. I'll exit out of this and I'll show one other area. The command vi sudo allows you to access the configuration file for these sudo privileges. Notice as a regular user, I don't have permission to run this command. If I add sudo to the command, I'm asking to do this as the superuser, and I should be able to gain access to editing the file. Arrow down until I see the wheel group configuration. Here we can see several options on how the wheel group gets configured. The hash sign or pound sign shows configuration settings that are commented out. We can see that this line here does not have a comment and is the active configuration for the wheel group. While this may not be obvious to you as new Linux users, this line says that all members of the wheel group have access to all commands and do not require an entry of a password to use them. I do not recommend these settings in a production environment, but we use these in our learning environments to make it easier for users to interact and try out the sudo access. Oftentimes, we do want to actually switch to the root user. With the sudo command, we can do this as well. As a user, I may not have been given the root password, but if I've been extended sudo privileges, one of the things I can do is use sudo to switch to the root user. This will allow me full administrative control of everything in the file system with my new elevated privileges. We can see the command sudo su dash would ask for us to invoke our sudo privileges to switch users and load the root user's environmental shell. Let's do that in a terminal. Here, I'll give it a try. Sudo su dash. As the superuser, switch users to the root user. As I'm configured to allow sudo access without passwords, I'm not prompted for my password in this environment, but I have successfully switched to the root user. You can also see that my current working directory has changed to load the environmental home directory of the root user, the directory /root. That concludes our section on the superuser access. Join us in our next video to follow along in a guided exercise with these skills.